What if the life you built filled with ambition and control was shattered by a single phone call? For Daniel Harper, a successful but solitary billionaire, that call came on New Year's Eve. A nurse's voice delivered the impossible news. He was a father, and the woman he once loved, Rachel Carter, was gone. But this was only the beginning. As Daniel took his first uncertain steps into fatherhood, he discovered that Rachel's death was no accident, and the secrets she left behind were far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Who could he trust as he uncovered the truth? How far would someone go to keep the past buried? And when the stakes rose higher, threatening his daughter Evelyn, could Daniel protect what mattered most? Through loss, betrayal, and moments of quiet hope, Daniel's journey is one of resilience and redemption, a story that reminds us that even in the darkest moments, love can be a beacon of light. The luxurious silence of Daniel Harper's penthouse was shattered by the shrill ring of his phone. It was New Year's Eve, and the city below was alive with celebration. Yet Daniel sat alone, nursing a glass of scotch, the countdown to midnight ticking away in the background. His phone buzzed again. With a sigh, he picked it up. "Harper," he answered, his voice clipped. "Mr. Harper, this is Nurse Collins from St. Mercy's Hospital," a calm voice replied. "We need you to come in immediately. It's about your daughter." Daniel froze. I don't have a daughter." The nurse's voice softened, but held a quiet urgency. "You do, Mr. Harper. Her name is Evelyn, and the mother, Rachel Carter, listed you as the father before she passed." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The name Rachel Carter hit him like a lightning strike. Rachel, the woman he had loved but let slip away. It had been years, but the memory of her remained as vivid as ever. "This must be a mistake," Daniel murmured, though the certainty in his voice wavered. "Rachel left a letter for you," the nurse said gently. "Please come. Evelyn needs you." The room spun. He gripped the back of the chair for support, trying to piece together what was happening. After a long pause, he finally whispered, "I'll be there." At the hospital, Daniel's world became a blur of sterile hallways and muted conversations. A nurse handed him a sealed envelope with his name in Rachel's handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened it. "Dear Daniel, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I didn't tell you about Evelyn because I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that keeping her from you was wrong. Evelyn needs her father. And Daniel, there's more to my story than you know." Daniel stared at the words, his breath catching in his throat. The letter ended abruptly, as if Rachel had run out of time. "Would you like to meet her?" the nurse asked, breaking the silence. Daniel nodded, barely able to speak. In the neonatal unit, he saw her tiny, swaddled in pink, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. Her dark hair curled against her forehead, just like Rachel's. A rush of protectiveness surged through him. "Evelyn," he whispered, testing her name. The baby stirred, her tiny fingers curling around his. In that moment, Daniel knew that his life had changed forever. But beneath the warmth of this newfound connection, a chill lingered. Rachel's death felt wrong, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that her final letter was only the beginning of a much larger story. The drive home from the hospital felt surreal. The city glimmered with fireworks and celebration, but Daniel Harper barely noticed. Evelyn was asleep in the car seat beside him, her tiny hand peeking out from beneath the blanket. Every so often he glanced at her, trying to process the reality of the moment. "Rachel is gone. I have a daughter." The words repeated in his mind like a broken record. But the letter she left behind haunted him even more. "There's more to my story than you know." What did she mean? Daniel pulled into the underground garage of his building, his thoughts a whirlwind. The penthouse, once a fortress of solitude, now felt like unfamiliar territory. He carried Evelyn inside with an awkward but careful grip and set her gently in the bassinet, the hospital had provided. He stood over her for a long moment, watching her peaceful face. In her features, he saw pieces of Rachel, her delicate nose, the soft curls of her hair. Emotion tightened his throat. Why didn't she tell me sooner? He reached for the letter again, unfolding it as if it might reveal something new. But the words remained the same. Rachel had left him a daughter and a mystery. A sharp chime broke the silence. Daniel's phone lit up on the counter, the screen flashing with an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Harper? There was a pause, followed by a low, gravelly voice. You should have stayed away. Daniel's pulse quickened. Who is this? Another pause. Then, Rachel didn't die by chance. The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone, his heart racing. He immediately called the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. Rachel didn't die by chance. Daniel sank into the nearest chair, the weight of the cryptic words pressing down on him. His mind churned with questions. Was the call some kind of sick prank, or was it something more? He looked over at Evelyn, who stirred briefly but didn't wake. He thought back to Rachel, her warmth, her laughter, but also the rare flickers of fear in her eyes. Had something or someone been haunting her before she died? The memories came rushing back. The last time he saw her, how she'd seemed distracted, almost worried. At the time, he thought it was because of their difficult goodbye, but now, his instincts, honed from years of leading a multi-billion-dollar corporation, told him that this wasn't just paranoia. Something was wrong. The next morning, Daniel barely slept. He was up at dawn, holding Evelyn in his arms as she let out small, sleepy coos. Her innocence felt like an anchor in the storm of uncertainty. By mid-morning, Daniel called an old contact, Ethan Reynolds, a private investigator and former journalist known for his relentless pursuit of the truth. Daniel Harper, Ethan greeted over the phone, his voice surprised. It's been years. I need your help, Daniel said without preamble. Ethan didn't hesitate. What's going on? Daniel told him everything: the letter, the unexpected phone call, Rachel's death. Ethan listened quietly before responding. Rachel Carter. I remember her, Ethan said thoughtfully. She disappeared from the public eye a few years ago. I always thought there was more to her story. There is, Daniel replied, his voice steady but grim. And I need to know what really happened. I'll start digging, Ethan assured him. But Daniel, be careful. If someone called to warn you, it means you're already in deeper than you realize. I know, Daniel muttered. His gaze shifted to Evelyn, who was now lying on the living room rug, kicking her tiny legs. But I'm not stopping. By afternoon, Daniel's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Ethan. Meet me at our old spot. I found something. An hour later, Daniel arrived at a quiet cafe tucked into a side street, a place he and Ethan used to meet back when Daniel was climbing the corporate ladder and needed off-the-record intel. Ethan was already seated in a booth at the back, a folder in front of him. His expression was grim. Daniel slid into the seat. What did you find? Ethan pushed the folder forward. Inside were copies of Rachel's medical records and police reports surrounding her death. Daniel's stomach churned as he read, The official report says complications during childbirth. Ethan leaned in. But the autopsy mentions bruising on her wrists consistent with someone being restrained. Daniel's blood ran cold. Restrained? Ethan nodded. It gets worse. There were signs that someone tampered with the hospital's records. Key footage from the security cameras was deleted during the exact window when Rachel was admitted. Daniel clenched his fists. Someone was covering their tracks. Ethan's voice dropped to a near whisper. There's more. I traced the deleted footage back to an encrypted file that only one person had access to. Daniel leaned forward, his jaw tight. Who? Ethan hesitated, then said a name that sent chills down Daniel's spine. Dr. Adrian Wells, the attending physician that night. Daniel's mind reeled. Dr. Wells had been a well-known figure in medical circles, a man respected for his philanthropic work. But now, his reputation was shrouded in suspicion. Why would a respected doctor risk everything? Daniel asked, his voice barely audible. Ethan's eyes narrowed. That's what we need to find out. But if Wells is involved, it means Rachel's death wasn't just a random tragedy. Someone wanted her gone. Daniel's grip on the folder tightened. Rachel had trusted him once, had believed he could protect her and their child. He wasn't about to let her down again. I'm going to find out the truth, Daniel said, his voice filled with quiet determination. For Rachel and for Evelyn. Ethan nodded. We'll get to the bottom of this. But you need to be ready for whatever comes next. This might be bigger than you think. Daniel stood, the weight of the revelations settling over him like a storm cloud. As he stepped outside, Evelyn's face flashed in his mind, a reminder of why he couldn't afford to lose. Rachel's final words had been a plea for him to uncover the truth. And now, Daniel knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just a man mourning a loss. He was a father fighting for justice. Daniel's thoughts churned as he paced the penthouse. The walls, once symbols of stability, now seemed to close in on him. The name Dr. Adrian Wells repeated in his mind like a warning siren. How could someone so renowned be linked to something so dark? Evelyn cooed from her bassinet, her wide eyes locking on his face. The innocence in her gaze grounded him. He gently lifted her and cradled her in his arms. I'm going to make this right, he whispered, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. But first, he needed answers. The next morning, Daniel drove to St. Mercy's Hospital. The building loomed ahead, its glass facade gleaming under the winter sun, a sterile fortress of secrets. He parked and made his way inside, his pulse steady, but his instincts on high alert. Nurses and doctors moved with quiet purpose, their expressions distant and focused. At the reception desk, a young clerk greeted him. Can I help you? I'd like to speak with Dr. Adrian Wells, Daniel said, keeping his tone calm. The clerk frowned. Dr. Wells isn't seeing anyone without an appointment. Daniel leaned forward, meeting her gaze. It's urgent. Please. She hesitated, then picked up the phone and made a brief call. After a moment, she nodded. Room 3 to 12. He's between rounds. The hallway leading to Dr. Wells's office was dimly lit, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead adding to the unease settling in Daniel's chest. He reached the door, took a deep breath, and knocked. Come in, a voice called. Daniel stepped inside. Dr. Wells sat behind a polished mahogany desk, reviewing a patient file. He was older than Daniel remembered, graying hair, deep lines etched across his face, but his presence was as sharp as ever. Wells glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. Mr. Harper, isn't it? I heard you were here last night. Daniel closed the door behind him and took a seat without being invited. We need to talk about Rachel Carter. A flicker of something discomfort. Recognition? Crossed Wells's face, but he masked it quickly. He closed the file in front of him and leaned back. Rachel's death was tragic, Wells said, his voice measured. But I'm not sure how I can help you. Daniel's jaw tightened. She trusted you? You were her attending doctor. And now I'm hearing things that don't add up. Wells's expression darkened. Be careful, Mr. Harper. Accusations without proof can lead you down dangerous paths. Daniel leaned in. I don't need proof to know something's wrong. Security footage deleted, bruises that don't match the report. Do you expect me to believe that's all a coincidence? For the first time, Wells's composure cracked. He stood and walked to the window, staring out over the city. You have no idea what you're digging into, he murmured. Then tell me, Daniel pressed. Why would anyone want Rachel dead? Wells was silent for a long moment, his shoulders tense. Finally, he spoke. Rachel was trying to protect someone. Daniel's pulse quickened. Protect who? Wells turned, his eyes filled with something Daniel didn't expect: fear. You. The word hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. What are you talking about? Wells's gaze hardened. Rachel knew something about the organization funding parts of this hospital, things she wasn't supposed to know. She was warned to stay quiet, but she couldn't. She told me she had proof, and that if anything happened to her, you'd be the next target. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. What kind of organization? Wells shook his head. I don't know the full picture, but they're powerful. They have influence everywhere. The deleted footage, the altered reports, it all points back to them. Daniel's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they painted a picture more dangerous than he'd imagined. Rachel hadn't just been scared, she'd been hunted. A sudden knock at the door made both men jump. Wells's assistant poked her head in, looking uneasy. Dr. Wells, there's someone here to see you. Wells's eyes widened in alarm. I told you no visitors. I didn't have a choice, she whispered. They insisted. Daniel tensed as the door opened further, revealing a tall man in a dark suit. His gaze swept the room before settling on Wells. We need to talk, the man said coldly, ignoring Daniel entirely. Wells's face paled. Not now. The man stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Yes, now. Daniel rose to his feet, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but he couldn't. Who are you? The man smiled without warmth. Just someone making sure loose ends don't unravel. Daniel's fists clenched. If you're here to intimidate someone, it won't work. The man's eyes narrowed. This is bigger than you, Mr. Harper. Walk away. You have a daughter to think about. Daniel's blood ran cold at the mention of Evelyn. His protective instincts surged. Is that a threat? It's advice, the man replied smoothly. He glanced at Wells. You should have kept quiet. Wells's breathing quickened. He deserves to know the truth. The man's expression darkened. Then you've already sealed your fate. Before Daniel could react, the man's hand darted inside his coat, but Daniel moved faster. He grabbed a heavy paperweight from the desk and slammed it against the man's wrist, forcing him to drop whatever he'd been reaching for. A small black device clattered to the floor, a stun gun. The man staggered back, eyes wide with fury. Daniel shoved Wells toward the door. Go! Wells hesitated for a split second, then bolted into the hallway. Daniel followed, heart pounding as the man in the suit shouted behind them. They burst into the emergency stairwell, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Wells's breath came in ragged gasps as they descended. What now? Wells panted. We get you somewhere safe, Daniel said grimly. They reached the ground floor and slipped out through the side entrance. Daniel's car was parked nearby, and he helped Wells into the passenger seat before jumping behind the wheel. As they sped away from the hospital, Daniel's mind was already working through their next move. The man in the suit wouldn't give up, and whoever was pulling the strings wasn't going to stop until the truth stayed buried, or until Daniel and Evelyn were silenced. The drive through the winding forest road was cloaked in a heavy silence, broken only by the steady hum of the engine. Daniel kept his focus on the path ahead, the trees arching over like a dark tunnel. The air grew colder as they neared their destination. Wells sat quietly in the passenger seat, fidgeting with his coat. His earlier fear still lingered in the tense lines of his face. Tell me again, Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. This safe house? Rachel trusted it with everything? Wells nodded. She said if anything ever happened to her, everything we'd need to understand would be there. But she was afraid someone might find it before you did. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The thought of Rachel being forced to live in fear deepened his resolve. Whatever she had left behind, it had to be important. The cabin appeared as the trees parted, a modest structure with weathered wood and a stone chimney. Despite its age, it seemed sturdy. Standing quietly in the clearing, like a guardian of secrets. Daniel pulled the car to a stop and scanned the area. All was still, but his instincts stayed sharp. "Stay close," he said to Wells as they approached the door. The inside of the cabin was simple: a small kitchen, an armchair by the window, and a desk pushed against the far wall. The scent of pine lingered, a faint echo of the time Rachel must have spent there. Daniel went straight to the desk. The drawers were locked, but when he checked underneath, he found a small key taped to the underside. He unlocked the drawer and pulled out a metal box, heavy and cold to the touch. Wells leaned closer. "Is that it?" Daniel set the box on the desk and opened it. Inside were stacks of papers, a flash drive, and a small leather-bound notebook. The sight of Rachel's familiar handwriting sent a pang through his chest. He flipped through the papers: financial records, private emails, and lists of names. He recognized some people tied to powerful companies and institutions. His jaw tightened as he began to understand the magnitude of what Rachel had uncovered. "It's all here," Daniel murmured. "Proof of payments, altered records, everything." Wells's eyes widened. She was right. They've been hiding this for years. Daniel picked up the flash drive. "We need to see what's on this." He reached for his laptop, but a noise from outside made him freeze. The faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. Daniel moved to the window, careful to stay in the shadows. Headlights pierced through the darkness as an SUV rolled into the clearing. Two figures stepped out, their movements purposeful. Wells's face went pale. "They found us." Daniel's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He grabbed the metal box and handed it to Wells. "Take this and hide," he said quietly. "If anything happens, get it to Ethan Reynolds." Wells hesitated. "What about you?" Daniel's gaze was steady. "I'll handle this. Go." Wells nodded reluctantly and slipped out the back door, disappearing into the trees. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped away from the desk. He couldn't risk a confrontation escalating. His focus was on buying Wells time to get the files to safety. The front door creaked as it opened, and the two men stepped inside. One of them glanced around the room, his expression cold and calculating. "We know you're here," the man said. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Daniel stepped forward, keeping his tone steady. "You're trespassing. Leave." The man's gaze narrowed. "We're not leaving without what we came for." Daniel's shoulders tensed, but he kept his expression neutral. "There's nothing here for you." The man took a step closer, but Daniel held his ground. He could feel the weight of the tension in the room, both men assessing the other. After a long moment, the man finally spoke again. "You have a child now, don't you?" Daniel's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Evelyn. The calm facade cracked as a wave of protectiveness surged through him. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Daniel asked, his voice low. "It's a reminder," the man replied. "You've got something to lose." Daniel met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "And that's why I won't stop." The man seemed to calculate his next move. After a moment, he motioned to his partner. "Let's go." Daniel watched as they turned and left the cabin, their departure as deliberate as their arrival. The SUV's headlights disappeared into the trees, leaving behind an eerie silence. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. Wells emerged from the back, clutching the metal box tightly. "They're gone," Daniel said, though his mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. Wells's expression was a mix of awe and fear. "What now?" Daniel picked up the flash drive and slipped it into his pocket. "We get this to Ethan. Whatever's on here, it's time the truth came out." Wells nodded, but the worry in his eyes remained. "Are you ready for what happens when it does?" Daniel looked out into the darkness. The answer came without hesitation. "For Rachel and for Evelyn," he said quietly. "Yes." The hum of the laptop was the only sound in Ethan Reynolds's dimly lit office. Daniel sat across from him, his gaze locked on the screen as Ethan inserted the flash drive. The files loaded slowly, each second dragging as the anticipation tightened in Daniel's chest. Wells paced near the window, nervously glancing at the drawn blinds. "Are you sure this place is secure?" Ethan nodded without looking up. "Triple-layered encryption on the network, and I've taken precautions. Nobody's tracking us." The screen flickered, revealing a list of file names. Some were labeled with vague codes, while others were more direct. Patient X, financial transfers, confidential agreements. Ethan clicked the first file. The screen filled with pages of emails, medical charts, and spreadsheets. Daniel leaned closer, scanning the content. His breath caught as he recognized the hospital's name at the top of several documents. "These are patient records," Daniel muttered. "But look at the signatures." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Dr. Wells didn't sign these." Daniel's heart sank. The records bore forged signatures from other doctors at St. Mercy's Hospital, making it look as though certain patients had died due to natural causes. But the details, missing treatments, altered dosages, painted a darker picture. "They were covering up malpractice," Ethan said grimly. "But this isn't just about negligence. They were falsifying reports to hide something." Daniel's jaw clenched. "But why?" Ethan opened another file, this one titled Foundation Transfers. A web of bank transactions appeared, linking donations from the hospital's private benefactors to offshore accounts under unfamiliar names. "Look at this," Ethan said, pointing to the data. "Millions of dollars being funneled through shell companies." Daniel's stomach churned. This isn't just corruption. It's an operation. Rachel was trying to expose something massive. Ethan nodded. And someone didn't want her to. The air in the room grew heavier as they opened the final folder. It contained scanned, handwritten notes, Rachel's notes. Daniel's heart pounded as he read the familiar loops of her handwriting. "I was right. Dr. Wells wasn't involved. He was used. But someone higher up is pulling the strings." One name appeared at the bottom of the page, underlined twice: Eleanor Hurst. Daniel froze. The name felt like a jolt to his system. Eleanor Hurst was a powerful figure in the business world, a philanthropist who'd built a reputation on charity work and medical advancements. But Daniel knew another side to her. Years ago, during one of his first deals, he'd seen glimpses of her ruthlessness. "Eleanor Hurst," Ethan repeated, his brow furrowing. "The head of the Hurst Foundation?" Daniel nodded, his mind racing. "She's not just a donor. She controls the board at St. Mercy's." Wells's voice wavered. "She's untouchable. If she's behind this, how do we fight her?" Daniel's gaze hardened. "By making the truth public." Ethan leaned back, considering the next step. "It's risky. If we go public without solid protection, she'll bury this story and us with her connections." Daniel knew he was right. Eleanor Hurst wasn't the kind of person who would stand idly by while her empire crumbled. But this wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about justice for Rachel and ensuring Evelyn's future wasn't haunted by the shadows of this conspiracy. By nightfall, Daniel returned to the penthouse with Evelyn bundled in his arms. She let out a soft yawn, her small hand reaching for his shirt. The sight of her innocence in contrast to the chaos surrounding them made his resolve even stronger. He laid her gently in the crib and watched as she drifted into sleep. The quiet hum of the city lights outside cast a soft glow over her tiny face. Daniel sat by her side, whispering, "I'm doing this for you. I'll make sure you're safe." His phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was a message from Ethan. "Meet me at dawn. I have an idea." The next morning, Daniel arrived at Ethan's office, where the investigator was already setting up cameras and microphones. "We're taking this public," Ethan said, determination blazing in his eyes. "But not in the way they expect. We'll do a live broadcast, anonymous, secure. We'll release the files to every major outlet at once. Daniel folded his arms. What about retaliation? Ethan's expression softened. It'll come, but if we control the narrative from the start, they won't be able to spin it fast enough. Daniel nodded. Then let's do it. Hours later, they went live. The screen displayed the damning files while Ethan's modulated voice narrated the story. The truth of the cover-ups, the missing patients, and the illegal transfers was laid bare for the world to see. Daniel watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding. It wasn't just a broadcast, it was a reckoning. Within minutes, the broadcast spread like wildfire. News stations picked up the story. Social media buzzed with reactions ranging from shock to outrage. Then Daniel's phone buzzed again this time, a number he recognized. Eleanor Hurst. He hesitated for only a moment before answering. Daniel. Eleanor's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. You've made quite the scene. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. The truth deserved to be seen. Eleanor's silence lingered for a moment too long. You're brave, she said finally. Braver than Rachel was. But bravery has its cost. Daniel's pulse spiked at her thinly veiled threat. If you try anything— Careful, Eleanor interrupted, her voice like ice. You're in over your head. Daniel exhaled slowly, refusing to let her words shake him. No, you are. He ended the call and turned to Ethan. We're not done. This is just the beginning. Ethan nodded. Then let's make sure we finish what Rachel started. As Daniel stepped outside, the city felt different, charged with the power of truth. Evelyn's future was still uncertain, but he knew one thing. He would fight to make sure she lived free of the fear that had haunted Rachel. The morning after the broadcast, the world felt different, but not in the way Daniel had expected. The headlines blared across every major news outlet. Medical cover-up exposed, Hearst Foundation under fire. Social media exploded with outrage, journalists demanded statements, and independent investigators began dissecting the files that Daniel and Ethan had released. Daniel sat by the window in his penthouse, Evelyn asleep in his arms, as he watched the chaos unfold on the news. He should have felt relief, but he didn't. A storm was brewing, and he knew Eleanor Hurst wasn't the type to go down quietly. His phone buzzed with constant notifications, but one text caught his eye. It was from Clara, his younger sister. Saw the broadcast. I'm proud of you. Call me when you can. Daniel smiled faintly. Clara had always been the one person who never gave up on him, even when he'd buried himself in work. The thought of reconnecting with her felt like a lifeline in the middle of the storm. His moment of calm was shattered by the ringing of his front door buzzer. Daniel's stomach tightened. He wasn't expecting anyone. Carefully, he placed Evelyn in her crib and moved toward the intercom. Who is it? He asked. It's Ethan, came the familiar voice. Let me in. Daniel exhaled and opened the door. Ethan stepped inside, his face set in grim determination. You need to see this, Ethan said, handing Daniel a tablet. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he read the news article on the screen. Daniel Harper's involvement questioned amid exposed fallout. The story twisted the narrative, suggesting that Daniel's motives weren't about justice, but about a vendetta against Eleanor Hurst. The article included an old photo of Daniel shaking hands with Eleanor at a charity gala years ago, a thin attempt to paint him as complicit in the scandal. They're trying to turn this around, Ethan muttered. She's using her connections to muddy the waters. Daniel felt the familiar weight of frustration pressing down on him. Of course she is. He tossed the tablet onto the counter. She'll drag me through the mud until people forget the real story. She's already started, Ethan said darkly, and it gets worse. Clara called me. Someone followed her on her way home from work. Daniel's head snapped up. What? She's okay, Ethan assured him. But she's scared. She thinks it was a warning. Daniel's hands curled into fists. He had expected Eleanor to retaliate, but not by targeting the people he cared about. "I need to see her," Daniel said, grabbing his coat. Ethan nodded. "I'll come with you." Clara lived in a quiet brownstone in Brooklyn, far removed from the chaos of Daniel's life. When they arrived, Clara opened the door, her eyes worried but calm. She embraced Daniel tightly. "Are you okay?" he asked, searching her face for signs of distress. "I'm fine," Clara said, pulling him inside. "But it was unsettling. I noticed the car behind me about 5 blocks from here. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I turned, they turned." Daniel's chest tightened. Clara had always been strong, but he could see the fear lurking behind her brave smile. "You should come stay with me for a while," Daniel said, "just until things calm down." Clara's gaze softened. "I can't leave my life behind because of this, Daniel. You've always tried to handle everything on your own, but you don't have to protect me from this. I'm with you." Her words hit harder than he expected. She was right. He'd spent his whole life trying to shield people from his battles. But this wasn't just his fight anymore. Ethan cleared his throat. "We can take precautions. Security cameras, a safe route to work, anything that'll make you feel safer." Clara nodded. "Thank you." Daniel's phone buzzed again this time, a number he didn't recognize. He exchanged a glance with Ethan before answering. "Harper," Daniel said. A familiar voice, low and cold, came through the line. "Eleanor Hurst wants a meeting." Daniel's pulse quickened. "Where?" "Private suite at the Lexington Grand, noon tomorrow." "Come alone." The call ended before Daniel could respond. That night, Daniel sat by Evelyn's crib, watching her sleep. The soft rise and fall of her small chest were a reminder of everything he stood to lose. Ethan stood by the doorway, his arms crossed. "You know it's a trap." Daniel nodded. "Of course it is, but if Eleanor wants to talk, that means she's worried." "She doesn't do anything without an angle," Ethan said. "She might be trying to bargain or bait you into something worse." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I need to know what she's planning. If she thinks I'm walking into this blind, she's wrong." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but you're not going in unprepared." The next day, Daniel arrived at the Lexington Grand Hotel. The air was thick with tension as he took the private elevator to the top floor. The hallway leading to the suite was lined with polished wood and gold-trim opulence meant to intimidate. He reached the door and knocked once. It opened almost immediately, revealing a sharply dressed man who ushered him inside. The suite was sprawling, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Eleanor Hurst stood by the window, elegant and composed, as though the world wasn't collapsing around her. "Daniel," she greeted, her tone smooth. "I was hoping you'd come." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Let's skip the pleasantries. Why am I here?" Eleanor turned, a faint smile on her lips. "To offer you a solution." Daniel's eyebrows furrowed. "A solution?" "You've caused quite a stir," Eleanor continued. "But I'm willing to make all of this disappear. Your name cleared, your life back to normal. All I ask is that you walk away." Daniel's anger simmered beneath the surface. "Walk away? You think this is about me?" He took a step closer, his voice low but fierce. "Rachel died trying to expose you. And you think you can buy my silence?" Eleanor's smile faded. Her eyes sharpened. "Silence isn't a request, it's a necessity. You've made enemies who won't stop. I'm the only one who can protect you." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "The only one Evelyn needs protecting from is you." Eleanor's expression darkened. For the first time, he saw something behind the calm exterior, a flicker of uncertainty. "You've already lost," Daniel said quietly. "The truth is out, and I'm not afraid of you anymore." Eleanor's silence was telling. The balance of power had shifted, and she knew it. The silence between Daniel and Eleanor felt like a taut wire, ready to snap. The sun cast long streaks of gold across the suite's polished floors, but there was nothing warm about the air between them. Eleanor Hurst's composed mask faltered, replaced by something darker calculation mixed with frustration. Daniel had struck a nerve, and he knew it. "You've underestimated me," Eleanor said finally, her voice like steel. "You're not the first idealist who thought they could bring me down." Daniel took another step forward, his eyes locked on hers. "No, but I'll be the last." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor's expression shifted back to cold indifference. She reached into a nearby folder and pulled out a single photo, sliding it across the marble table toward Daniel. His breath caught as he picked it up. It was a grainy surveillance photo of Clara, pushing a cart of groceries near her apartment. Daniel's vision narrowed. "You've crossed a line." Eleanor's voice softened in a way that made his blood boil. "That's not a threat, Daniel. It's a reminder. You're not the only one who has people to protect." Daniel clenched his jaw, the weight of the message settling over him. She was telling him that even if she lost this battle, she could still make it personal. But instead of letting fear take hold, Daniel set the photo down calmly. "The difference between you and me, Eleanor, is that I don't break. I build." He locked eyes with her, his voice steady. "And I'm not leaving anyone behind." Eleanor's composure cracked again, if only for a second. She exhaled sharply, turning back toward the window. "You're forcing my hand." Daniel straightened, sensing the conversation was over. "Then go ahead, show me who you really are." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. In the elevator, Daniel's hands trembled slightly, but his resolve held. He wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. He was fighting for everyone he cared about. When the elevator reached the lobby, Ethan was waiting near the entrance, his posture tense. Daniel stepped out, shaking his head. "No deal," Daniel said grimly. Ethan's brow furrowed. "I figured. She won't let this go." Daniel nodded. "Which is why we need to finish this." Back at Ethan's office, the dim glow of computer monitors lit the room as the two of them worked late into the night. Wells was there too, nervously flipping through documents and double-checking files. Ethan pulled up a folder they had only skimmed before, one containing a list of offshore accounts linked to Eleanor's foundation. Most were labeled with numbers and meaningless abbreviations, but one stood out. "Look at this," Ethan said, pointing to the screen. "This account isn't tied to Eleanor directly. It's connected to a holding company in a state with notoriously weak financial regulations." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What's the name of the company?" Ethan clicked the file, revealing the name. Harbor Star Holdings. Daniel froze. The name wasn't random. It was tied to a legacy fund Eleanor had inherited years ago. But what caught his attention was the timestamp. One of the transfers had been made 2 weeks before Rachel's death. "She funneled money right before it all happened," Ethan said grimly. Daniel nodded, realization dawning. "She paid someone off, or she covered something up." Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Let's see if we can track where that money went." Moments later, a new window popped up with a digital trail showing transactions between Harbor Star Holdings and private entities across multiple states. But one name leaped off the screen: Lexcroft Research. Daniel's stomach tightened. Lexcroft. They're one of the pharmaceutical labs that worked with St. Mercy's. Ethan's eyes widened. That's it. Lexcroft must be connected to the altered reports their drug trials went through St. Mercy's. If Eleanor was covering up failed trials. Daniel exhaled, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. Rachel found out the truth. Ethan nodded, a grim smile forming. "We've got her. These files link her directly to the cover-up." But before they could celebrate, Wells's phone buzzed. He answered it quickly, his face paling. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Wells lowered the phone, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's Clara. Someone broke into her apartment." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. "Is she okay?" "She wasn't there," Wells replied. She's at a friend's place, but Daniel, her apartment was trashed. Daniel's heart pounded as fury and fear collided. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. We need to make sure she's safe. Ethan caught up to him. And then what? Daniel's eyes burned with determination. Then we end this for good. Clara's apartment building was quiet when they arrived, but the sight of the broken lock and splintered wood on her door filled Daniel with dread. Inside, the living room was in shambles, overturned furniture, shattered glass, drawers emptied. Clara's friend met them there, her voice low as she explained. Clara stayed at my place when she noticed something felt off. She's scared, Daniel. Daniel closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. His sister's safety came first, but the wreckage of her home was a stark reminder that this fight was no longer abstract. Ethan inspected the room, kneeling near the broken window. This wasn't random. They wanted to send a message. Daniel's fists clenched as he surveyed the destruction. Then we'll send one back. Back at the office, Daniel and Ethan compiled everything: financial records, emails, and evidence linking Eleanor Hurst to Lexcroft's failed trials. Ethan turned to Daniel, his expression serious. This is enough to take to the authorities, but once we do, there's no going back. Daniel nodded. We've already crossed that line. They set up another secure live stream, this time looping in trusted reporters and legal advisors who had followed the story from the beginning. The files were uploaded in real time, along with a statement Daniel had written himself. It wasn't about retaliation, it was about accountability. Within minutes, the broadcast gained traction. Major outlets picked it up, and social media erupted with calls for justice. Eleanor Hurst's empire was unraveling. That night, as Daniel sat by Evelyn's crib once more, a calm settled over him. He had taken every precaution to protect his family and bring the truth to light. As Evelyn stirred in her sleep, Daniel whispered, "We're almost there." But deep down, he knew the hardest battle was still ahead. The headlines hit like a tidal wave. Whistleblower exposes corruption, Hearst empire crumbling. The morning air was thick with anticipation. Every major news network was airing segments about the documents Daniel and Ethan had released. Investigative reporters tore apart the financial webs Eleanor Hurst had spun for years, and public outcry grew louder with every passing hour. But for Daniel Harper, there was no time to celebrate. He had seen this kind of desperation before, and Eleanor Hurst wouldn't go down without a fight. As Daniel rocked Evelyn in her crib, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from Ethan. "It's everywhere," Ethan said. His voice was calm but strained. "She's been subpoenaed. The Attorney General's office is all over this." Daniel let out a slow breath. "Then it's almost over." Ethan hesitated. "Not quite. I've been hearing things. Hearst's people are scrambling. There's a rumor that she's planning something big to shift the narrative." Daniel's heart sank. He knew Eleanor too well. When backed into a corner, she wouldn't just surrender, she'd burn everything down with her. As he hung up, Daniel's instincts kicked in. He called Clara immediately. She picked up on the second ring. "Daniel?" Her voice was tense but steady. "I need you to stay put," Daniel said. "Keep your doors locked. If you see anything out of place, call me." Clara sighed. "I'm fine, Daniel. You can't protect everyone all the time." Daniel's throat tightened. "Just promise me." Clara's silence lingered before she relented. "I promise." By noon, the world seemed to hold its breath as news stations speculated on Eleanor Hurst's next move. Daniel sat with Ethan in the small office, the hum of computers filling the quiet. Then Ethan's phone chimed with a new alert. His face paled as he read it aloud. "Breaking news. Explosion at Harbor Star headquarters. Details unfolding." Daniel shot to his feet. "What?" Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up a live feed from the scene. Flames engulfed part of the glass skyscraper that housed one of Hearst's key financial operations. Smoke billowed into the sky as sirens blared in the background. No way that's a coincidence, Ethan muttered. Daniel's stomach churned. She's erasing everything. Ethan nodded grimly. All the files, the backups, it's her way of cutting the cord. If there's no evidence left to track, she thinks she can walk away from this. Daniel clenched his fists. We still have the files we released. She can't undo that. Ethan hesitated. She might not be trying to undo it. She might be trying to distract. As the thoughts settled between them, Daniel's phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Ethan or Wells. It was Clara. He answered quickly. Clara? Her voice was shaky. Daniel, I think someone's outside. The world seemed to stop. Where are you? Daniel demanded, already grabbing his keys. I'm still at my apartment, Clara said. I thought I heard footsteps on the stairs, and now my door handle. Her voice caught, a soft sound of fear slipping through. Clara? Listen to me, Daniel said, forcing calm into his voice. Go to the back room, lock the door, and stay on the line. Ethan was already beside him, grabbing a jacket. We're going. The drive to Clara's apartment felt like a blur of flashing traffic lights and cold air rushing past. Daniel's mind was a storm of fear and anger. When they reached the building, Daniel barely waited for the car to stop before he jumped out. He sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time, Ethan close behind. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. The door to Clara's apartment was slightly ajar. Daniel's heart pounded as he pushed it open fully. Clara! A soft voice came from the back room. Daniel? Relief flooded through him as he found Clara, her face pale but unharmed. She rushed into his arms, shaking. I thought, Clara began, but her voice faltered. Daniel pulled back and held her shoulders. You're safe now. Ethan scanned the apartment. No sign of anyone. They're probably long gone. Daniel exhaled slowly, but didn't let his guard down. Whoever had been there had wanted Clara scared or worse. I'm not taking any more chances, Daniel said. You're coming with me. You're staying where I can protect you. Clara's eyes softened, but she nodded. Okay. Back at Daniel's penthouse, Clara settled on the couch with a blanket while Evelyn babbled in her playpen. The sight of them together, his sister and his daughter, strengthened Daniel's resolve. We're running out of time, Daniel said to Ethan as they stood by the window. She's trying to burn it all down, and if we don't stop her, she'll walk away from this. Ethan's eyes flickered with determination. Then we take away her escape route. Daniel's mind sharpened. The private jet. Ethan nodded. Her foundation's records show she's registered to leave the country tomorrow morning. We need to make sure she never gets on that plane. Daniel's pulse steadied as a plan formed. They couldn't rely solely on the public outcry. They needed to act now. As night fell, Daniel and Ethan contacted their legal team and reporters who had been covering the story. They filed for an immediate injunction to freeze Eleanor Hurst's assets and prevent her from fleeing. The final blow came when the Attorney General's office, under immense public pressure, issued a warrant for Eleanor's arrest. At dawn, news helicopters circled the private airfield as Eleanor's jet sat grounded. The headlines flashed across every screen. Eleanor Hurst, detained at airport, arrest warrant executed. Daniel watched from his living room, Evelyn in his arms, as the camera caught Eleanor being escorted away by law enforcement. Her calm facade had cracked, replaced by cold fury. It's over, Ethan said quietly. Daniel nodded, his shoulders finally relaxing. But he wasn't thinking about Eleanor. He was thinking about Rachel. He whispered, "We did it." Later that evening, Daniel took Evelyn to the park for the first time in weeks. The air was crisp, the sky painted with the warm hues of sunset. As Evelyn laughed and reached for the falling leaves, Daniel felt something lift from his heart. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. Clara joined him on the bench, watching Evelyn with a soft smile. "You kept your promise," Daniel nodded. "To Rachel, to Evelyn. And to you. Clara squeezed his hand. She'd be proud of you. Daniel's eyes shimmered, but he smiled. I hope so. Evelyn let out a squeal of delight as the wind carried a leaf past her. Daniel scooped her up, twirling her gently as her laughter filled the air. The weight of the past year hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a foundation, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, love and resilience could build something new. As the sun set and the city lights flickered on, Daniel knew this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. The morning air was calm, carrying the scent of freshly fallen leaves as the city settled into its autumn rhythm. Daniel sat at his desk, Evelyn babbling happily from her playmat nearby. His life, once filled with boardrooms and relentless ambition, had shifted into something new, something meaningful. The television in the background played muted headlines about Eleanor Hurst's indictment. Legal analysts speculated about the charges piling up against her, while footage of her being escorted away played in a loop. But Daniel had stopped watching. It wasn't about Eleanor anymore, it was about what came next. As Evelyn cooed, Daniel's attention drifted to Rachel's notebook sitting on the desk. It had been weeks since he'd last opened it, but today something compelled him. He ran his fingers over the worn leather cover, remembering how meticulous Rachel had been in her thoughts and plans. She'd carried the weight of so much alone, yet she had always believed in something bigger than herself. When he opened the notebook, a page folded at the corner caught his eye. For Evelyn, with love. Daniel's breath caught as he read the words, handwritten in Rachel's familiar flowing script. Beneath them was an address, a small town on the coast. His heart stirred with questions. Why had Rachel written this? Was this place special to her? Clara walked into the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She noticed the notebook in Daniel's hands and sat down beside him. You found something, she said softly. Daniel nodded, showing her the page. She wrote down an address. I don't know why, but I need to find out. Clara studied the page. It could be where she planned to take Evelyn if things had been different. Daniel's chest tightened. Maybe. He glanced at Evelyn, who was busy trying to stack colorful blocks. But I won't know unless I go. Clara rested a hand on his shoulder. Then you owe it to her, to both of them. The next morning, Daniel packed a small bag for the trip. He decided for Clara to stay with Evelyn while he was away. As he kissed Evelyn's forehead, she giggled and reached for his face, her tiny fingers brushing against his cheek. I'll be back soon, Daniel whispered, his voice soft but steady. Clara smiled reassuringly. We'll be fine. Go. The drive to the coastal town was quiet, the miles unfolding beneath a pale blue sky. Daniel's thoughts were a jumble of emotions, curiosity, hope, and a lingering ache. He wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted to understand the life Rachel had envisioned for their daughter. By midday, he reached the town, a peaceful place with colorful cottages and a sweeping view of the ocean. The address led him to a modest beachside house with a white picket fence and flower beds lining the path. The sight of it felt surreal, as though he had stepped into a memory that wasn't his own. Daniel parked the car and walked toward the front porch, his heart beating steadily. When he reached the door, he hesitated before knocking. After a moment, the door opened, revealing an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Can I help you? She asked. Daniel cleared his throat. I'm looking for someone connected to Rachel Carter. My name is Daniel Harper. The woman's expression softened as recognition dawned. You're Daniel. She opened the door wider. Come in. Daniel stepped inside, the scent of lavender filling the cozy living room. A quilt lay folded over the back of a rocking chair, and family photos lined the shelves. I'm Marion, the woman said, motioning for him to sit. I was Rachel's godmother. Daniel blinked in surprise. She never mentioned you. Marion's smile was sad but understanding. Rachel didn't talk much about her past, did she? Daniel shook his head. She always kept certain parts of her life separate, but she trusted you. He paused, glancing around. Is this where she planned to bring Evelyn? Marian nodded. Yes. After everything started unraveling, she told me she might need a safe place, a place where she could give Evelyn the kind of life she deserved. Daniel's throat tightened. She wanted to escape, didn't she? Marian's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She was tired of running, Daniel, but she never gave up hope. She believed that if she couldn't give Evelyn a normal life, you would. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. Marian reached for a small photo frame on the table beside her. She handed it to Daniel, a picture of Rachel standing barefoot on the beach, holding a seashell to her ear and laughing. She loved it here, Marian said softly. It was the one place where she could just be herself. Daniel stared at the photo, memorizing every detail. Rachel's smile was radiant free, in a way he hadn't seen in years. She wanted Evelyn to feel that freedom, Marian continued, to know what it was like to be surrounded by love. Daniel's voice was quiet, almost reverent. She'll know. Marian's smile grew, though it was tinged with sadness. You're a good father, Daniel, and Rachel knew you would be. After thanking Marian and promising to stay in touch, Daniel stepped out onto the porch. The sea breeze was cool, carrying the scent of salt and driftwood. He walked down to the beach, the sand soft beneath his feet. He stood at the water's edge, letting the waves lap at his shoes. The sky stretched endlessly above him, vast and calm. Daniel pulled Rachel's notebook from his coat pocket and opened it to the page with her handwritten message. For Evelyn, with love. I understand now, Daniel murmured, his voice carried by the wind. He felt a strange sense of peace, not because everything was perfect, but because he finally understood Rachel's heart. She had wanted Evelyn to grow up in a world where love, not fear, shaped her future. Daniel took a deep breath and closed the notebook, tucking it back into his coat. He had come seeking answers, but found something greater, a sense of purpose rooted not in the past, but in the promise of the life they were building. As he turned back toward the car, the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the waves. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt the weight of grief lift, replaced by something stronger. Hope. The sun had just begun to rise as Daniel's car pulled into the familiar driveway of the penthouse. The city was waking up, golden light stretching across the skyline. As he stepped out, suitcase in hand, the sight of Evelyn and Clara through the window warmed him. Clara was twirling Evelyn around the living room, her laughter echoing through the glass. Daniel smiled a genuine, unburdened smile. After everything, he was finally home. The door opened before he could knock. Clara stood there with an exaggerated frown. 3 days, she teased. That's how long you were gone. Evelyn almost led a search party. Daniel chuckled as Evelyn toddled toward him, her arms outstretched. He scooped her up, holding her close as she babbled happily. I missed you too, sweetheart, he whispered. Clara crossed her arms. So, did you find what you were looking for? Daniel's gaze softened as he thought about the quiet beach, Marian's words, and Rachel's memory. Yes, more than I expected. Clara nodded, sensing there was more, but she didn't push. Good. You needed this. Daniel set Evelyn down in her play area, watching as she grabbed her favorite stuffed bear and plopped down contentedly. He turned to Clara. I've made a decision, Daniel said. It's time to build something meaningful, something in Rachel's honor. Clara's brow lifted. What are you thinking? Daniel took a steadying breath. A foundation for single parents, those who need a support system, like Rachel did. Resources, childcare, job training. A place where they don't have to feel alone. Clara's eyes softened. She would have loved that. Daniel nodded. It's what she deserved. 2 months later, the Harper Carter Foundation was launched with a quiet but heartfelt opening ceremony. Unlike the grand, flashy events Daniel used to host for his company, this one was intimate and meaningful. The foundation's new building stood in the heart of the city, a bright, welcoming space with playrooms, classrooms, and counseling offices. Families filtered in throughout the morning, curious and hopeful. Daniel stood at the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. He wore a simple suit, but in his arms was the most important part of the day, Evelyn, dressed in a soft blue dress that Clara had picked out. As he held her, Daniel spotted Marion stepping through the door, a warm smile on her face. He walked over to greet her. "You made it," Daniel said, genuinely touched. Marion nodded, her eyes bright. "I wouldn't miss it. Rachel would be so proud." Daniel swallowed the emotion threatening to rise. "Thank you for everything." Marion reached out and gently brushed Evelyn's curls. "She's got her mother's spirit and her father's courage." Daniel's heart swelled as he glanced at Evelyn. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes, and he felt a familiar sense of peace. As the morning went on, families toured the building while volunteers handed out welcome kits and hot coffee. Ethan arrived, holding a stack of brochures, his usual sharp suit replaced by something more casual. "You're really doing this," Ethan said with a grin as he handed out brochures, "turning a tech empire into a legacy of hope." Daniel smiled, shaking hands with a single mother who had just arrived with her 2 kids. "I think I was always supposed to." Ethan nodded, then gestured toward the entrance. "Looks like you've got another guest." Daniel turned and froze. Standing in the doorway was a man in his early 40s, wearing a navy coat and holding a small bouquet of white lilies. His expression was uncertain but hopeful. Daniel's heart skipped as recognition hit him. "Mark?" he murmured. The man nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's me." Clara appeared at Daniel's side, her eyes widening in shock. "Is that—" Daniel nodded again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel's brother." The world seemed to slow as Mark took a step forward. Daniel's thoughts raced. Rachel had once told him that her brother had drifted from the family after their parents passed. She'd never blamed him, only wished things had been different. Mark stopped in front of Daniel, his eyes flickering between Daniel and Evelyn. "I saw the news. I saw everything. And I needed to be here." Daniel exhaled, still trying to process the moment. "I didn't know if you—" He shook his head. "Why now?" Mark's gaze softened as he looked at Evelyn. "Rachel wrote to me once, about her daughter, about you. I didn't deserve it, but she forgave me long before I forgave myself." He hesitated, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm not here to disrupt your life. I just wanted to see the life she built." Daniel's heart softened. There was no anger, no bitterness, only an understanding of the complicated emotions they both carried. "Rachel wanted Evelyn to know where she came from," Daniel said quietly. "That includes you." Mark's eyes shimmered as he nodded. "Thank you." Daniel took a step back and motioned toward Evelyn, who was staring curiously at the stranger. "Come meet her." Mark knelt down, carefully extending a hand toward Evelyn. "Hi there," he said softly. "I'm your Uncle Mark." Evelyn stared for a moment, then reached out and grabbed his fingers, giggling as she did. Clara smiled through tears as she watched the scene unfold. Ethan gave Daniel a knowing nod before stepping back to give them space. Later, as the event wound down, Daniel found himself standing by the large windows, watching families leave with smiles and laughter. Evelyn rested in his arms, her small head nestled against his shoulder. Mark joined him, his expression thoughtful. "She's incredible," he said. Daniel smiled. "She saved me." Mark looked out at the cityscape. "Rachel would have been proud of you for all of this." Daniel's chest tightened. "I hope so." Mark turned to him, his voice steady. "I know so." As the evening sun dipped below the skyline, Daniel felt the weight of the past lift completely. The shadows of loss had given way to something brighter: family, love, and purpose. He kissed Evelyn's head gently, whispering, "We did it." The world outside was still unpredictable, but Daniel finally felt ready to embrace it with Evelyn by his side and Rachel's memory guiding him. It wasn't just the end of a journey, it was the beginning of something beautiful. As Daniel Harper's story ends, we're reminded that even in the face of loss and uncertainty, hope and love can build something extraordinary. Daniel's journey wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about healing, forgiveness, and finding purpose in the most unexpected places. What did this story inspire in you? Have you ever faced a challenge that made you see life in a new way? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support helps us share more inspiring stories that remind us all of the strength found in resilience and the beauty of second chances. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.